Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Warbreaker chat. I am joined by my sometimes frenemy, sometimes just friend, we're staying backstage, aka read by Kyle. We are going to be talking all about Warbreaker today by Brandon Sanderson. I think we'll probably do a little bit of non-spoilery stuff before we get into our spoiler chat for Warbreaker. But before we get started, how are you, Kyle?
I'm really good. As I was saying before we started, this is my first time recording anything in my new office. There are no bookshelves in here yet, but that will be
Yeah,
sorted out soon. And then this will look like an actual place, the booktubers booktube, and then I
and
will
hang
be
out.
making videos. So I'm very excited.
I am super excited to see your new space, also because I know it's been a long time coming. So
Yeah.
that's always really exciting. I love decorating a new space.
I know. I'm honestly so excited for it. I'm like looking at because my shelves are just like overloaded with books everywhere. I'm like, oh, but I can like, oh, they're all gonna, I'm just like prepping for it. So it's gonna
Yes.
be good.
Hey, Caleb. Hello. Caleb joined us
Hello.
for our buddy read. So that was really exciting. This was a very kind of impromptu thing in the sense that we were talking about Warbreaker last year. And I was saying, I love Warbreaker. I think I'm probably going to reread it in the beginning of next year. And then we decided to buddy read it. You have the very nice version. I
I
have
read out
the
of this copy though.
the
I was
basic
not brave.
version. Yeah, I have that, but hardback. But I will say, I have a signed version of that. So yeah, it's real
Well,
fancy. Josh got it for me for Christmas last year.
nice. I mean,
Yeah.
technically this one's signed too, but like they come that way, so it's not as cool.
I know that. Well, no, they don't all come that way.
That's true.
That's
I guess he
like
doesn't sign them anymore, but so I got
no,
like
that's
one of
that's
the
a lot of
special
extra
ones.
money now. So technically, if you
Yeah.
wanted to, you could sell that one and then get the basic one of that if you wanted
No, I'm
to.
good.
But Warbreaker is arguably my favorite Sanderson book, along with Words of Radiance. I just love, love, love Warbreaker. I know it's not your favorite in terms of overall reads, but you generally really like Warbreaker,
It
correct?
is my favorite of like the non-Stormlights. Well,
Okay.
Hero of Ages might like Hero of Ages is like a culmination of an arc, so I
Hmm.
feel like it maybe got me more emotional. But Warbreaker as a standalone, like he hasn't done anything as good as Warbreaker in my opinion. I really really like Warbreaker.
So when I went into my reading of Sanderson, Warbreaker was the fifth book that I read. I did all of Mistborn first, then Elantris, and then Warbreaker, which a lot of people kind of say is the general starting points for Sanderson. If you want to
Hmm.
go with the traditionally published order, you would start with Elantris, then Warbreaker, or Mistborn, then Warbreaker. But some people are like, if you want to just try something different and somewhat fun, start with Warbreaker. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that Warbreaker can be a really great gateway to
Hmm.
Sanderson and enjoying Sanderson, except apparently for my husband who just finished it and didn't like it. So
Listen, divorce papers don't cost that much money to get like ready.
yeah, so
You don't have to sign anything yet, but you can put them on ice. You know what I mean?
yeah, we can just keep that on hold for now. But Warbreaker, for me, when I read it the first time, I found it really interesting because it was a story of twos in a lot of ways for me, and that there's two cities, there's two sisters, there's two religions, and there's like two big forces kind of coming to a head in the story. And I
It's
really liked
interesting.
having that balance.
Yeah, I never thought of that, but that is true. It is a story of twos, and Mistborn is a story of fours. So,
And
uh,
16s.
yeah, but four to get to 16. I will say I was actually really nervous to reread this one because, so I started with Way of Kings. That was my first Sanderson, and like
Was it
I
really?
yeah, it was
Wave Kings
honestly
is your first Sanderson?
it. Not only was my first Sanderson, it was my first epic fantasy that was not a Song of Ice and Fire.
Okay.
Unless I mean,
Winning big.
if you count American Gods, but I don't. I consider that urban fantasy. But
It is urban
um,
fantasy, yeah.
so I started with Way of Kings. And I really loved it. I was just like, wow, I apparently really like epic fantasy. I didn't know this about myself. And then I, went on Reddit, and I still have my old little Reddit thread that I started that was like the one that everyone makes. And I'm like, why don't you guys just Google and see? But they're like, hi, what is the correct reading order?
Oh my
And
gosh, yeah. The biggest question was Sanderson. How do I read Sanderson? Or how do I read the
and
Cosmere?
a bunch of people were like, "Hey, Warbreaker's free on his site." So
Mm,
I read Warbreaker second, and I love Warbreaker, but
okay.
I've since read so much other Cosmere stuff. And so I was worried, especially I was like, well, it was like early Sanderson. A lot of people like are mid on Warbreaker.
Yeah,
Maybe I
they
won't like it as
are.
much. And
Mhm.
those people are objectively incorrect. Warbreaker is awesome. And I will say, my wife actually just read Warbreaker, like maybe in December. She read it for a very, very long time. She set it down for like 7 months, and I thought she was just never going to pick it back up. And then she picked it back up, and she was like, "Light Song really, really bothers me." And I'm like, "Am I going to have to get out the divorce papers?"
Yeah, no.
But then she
That's
hit a
bad take,
certain
Jess, bad take.
she heard hit a certain point, and then she was like, "Oh, this book is incredible." So she ended up really liking it.
Okay,
Um,
that's
so
great.
you know,
Yeah.
I had to put the
I
papers
so
away.
I love Light Song so much. Two of my favorite Cosmere characters are in this book. Like, of my top 3 characters, 2 are from this book, and I love them very deeply, and that's
Is the other
Nightblood
one
and Light
Nightblood?
Song.
Yeah, okay, I thought
Yeah.
so.
So I love good satirical stuff in any book. I really like it in fantasy, I've come to realize, and I Sanderson's humor is so hit or miss in general, not just for me, but general consensus in the fandom. It's really hit or miss. And I was curious because like you, it wasn't my, second Sanderson read, but it was really early on in all of the Sanderson that I read last year, which ended up being like 23 books. So I was curious how I was going to feel about it again on a reread in terms of the humor, because when I read Tress and Yumi, I liked the humor in Tress, but I hated it in Yumi. It did not work for me at all. And
That's
I was
strange.
thinking, is this going to be a thing where I read Warbreaker and I go, oh, I genuinely didn't actually like this. And I was fooled the first time, but no, I wasn't. I liked it again, which was really great. I actually think this is such a fun book to start off the year with, which is, I think it was my first or second read of the year. But it's just one of those stories that, despite it having a lot of darker undertones of what's going on politically and between the relationships of people, it is such a feel good book to me, all because of the humor that is in this book.
I think it's some of Sanderson's best humor. I also think, and this is more of a subtle thing, but I think it's focus on colors. Like when you visualize something colorful, we just naturally visualize
Feel
something
good.
happier and
Yeah.
peppier. I heard someone say one time that Warbreaker would make a really good musical, and I've never been able to get that out of my head. Like if you
Oh,
have
that's
people
true.
dancing with the colors and all that stuff, like I'll be
Yeah.
like, oh, it would translate super well as a musical, and
Yeah.
it's the tone of it, which like because there's some really objectively dark things that happen in this story, but yeah, and then like you also have Lightsong, who is a fool, and I love him to death, and I just
I do
like,
too.
man,
So
Lightsong
much.
is so good. Like I don't
It's
know why somebody could not like him.
I know. It's funny when now that you say that, I think it would make a really excellent Bollywood film with the bright colors,
Oh, I
dancing,
could see that
music.
for
Like
sure.
it
Yeah.
would fit that theme really, really well. But is there anything else you kind of have to say about Warbreaker non-spoilery before we jump into deep
Yeah.
dive
So
chat?
one thing I'm a little bit more on the lookout now as a Cosmere scholar, as I would call myself, is like the rereadability for a Cosmere fan. There's the
Hmm.
obvious, like I'm not going to say what they are, but there are the obvious connections to Stormlight that
Yes.
you pick up on. But I'm actually surprised that like the book is very very light on like the Cosmere connections later on. Like um, rereading Way of Kings the first time, you pick up on something new almost every chapter. You're like, wow,
Yeah.
this just see, and you can just tell that this is such a like early representation of his like ideas for the Cosmere because apart from like a couple capital letters that don't really mean much yet, it's
Yes.
pretty much no Easter eggy. So I say
No.
if you can read Warbreaker at any time, I fight the the very strong fight that the main Cosmere nerds get all mad about like reading Warbreaker before Words of Radiance. Everybody can just chill about that. It makes
Yeah.
Warbreaker, or sorry, it makes Words of Radiance better, but everything can be understood without it. Read it
Yeah.
whenever you want. It's an excellent book, and it doesn't require any homework.
I completely agree. I mean, I did read it before Words of Radiance, and I was personally happy that I did, but I
Yeah,
don't
so was
feel
I.
like it's gonna completely downgrade your reading experience of Words of Radiance if you
And
don't
I
read
think we
Warbreaker
need more
first.
people like you and me that are like, "You know what? It did help, but, like, it's okay if somebody else
Yeah,
experiences something differently than I do." Like,
exactly. It's not the end all be all of our existence if you don't read it
yeah.
before Words of Radiance. Okay, so we're gonna jump into spoilery chat now because we've got lots and lots of stuff to say. So speaking of Cosmere connections, it was interesting for me going back and seeing some of our world hoppers in their original form, right? Because when hello Brenton, thanks for
"Hey, Brendan,
stopping
how's it
by.
going?"
Um when I was reading, I think it was Words of Radiance, I was messaging you and I was like, I'm pretty sure this person is this person and this person is this person. And I really enjoyed going back to the beginning and re-immersing myself with how they were and how they used to be, and also seeing the evolution of those characters from a much wider lens as opposed to just viewing it from Warbreaker's perspective at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, super, super fun. So I really enjoyed that part of rereading it.
I paid a lot more attention to Nightblood in this reread. Not to say that I
Yeah.
mean, Nightblood is awesome, so it's not like I didn't care for the first time, but basically anytime they talked about Nightblood at all, I was like, so
100%. Yeah, I was paying very close attention to him. Um, so one of the things that I really loved the first time that I read Warbreaker, and I genuinely liked it just as much this time, was the relationship between Ciri and Susebron. I think in terms of the romantic relationships that Brandon has written, I think it's probably the best one that we have.
I
I
agree.
genuinely grew to really like we're gonna be
Actually,
talking about
it's my second favorite, but it's still very good.
so we'll get to that. I'm just gonna give a preface here and say we're gonna be talking about some Cosmere spoilers in general. So if you're not caught up on like Stormlight and stuff like that, and you don't want to know, tap out now. Um, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I genuinely like the Adolin and Shalyn romance later on. It grew on me, but and that was an earned relationship, I felt like
Yes.
over
Mhm.
time. But with Ciri and Susebron, it's one of those relationships in fantasy that so often people are thrust together and it's just forced and you go okay and you kind of just go all right, we're here for this. But I genuinely found that the compassion that Siri had for Susebron and his situation was very compelling. I liked them independent of each other and I liked them collectively. So for
Mhm.
me it was probably the most initially invested I got in any relationship that Sanderson has put out
It's
so
the
far.
only time I've, like, rooted for romance because I also really like Dalinar and
Oh,
Navani,
Navani, love them.
and
Love them
but
so
the
much.
difference in both of those relationships is at first, it felt very heavy-handed, and it's more like once they're actually together and they settle in, I'm like, "Oh, I actually
Yeah.
really like these people together." But I'm not a very big romance person,
I've
mainly
become
because the
one.
way
So
yeah, well, mainly it's because the way people write romance is not indicative to how I feel like people talk about romance or feel it from my perspective
fair.
a lot of the time.
That's fair.
Like, it's just like it takes over people's whole mind. And I'm just like, but if it's done well, then I really like it because I like human connection and like romance is
Yes.
a type of human connection. And so that's what I really like about the Siri and Susan Brown relationship because you're presented this situation where you feel like, as the reader, you know exactly where it's going to go and you clearly don't. He's not this like crazy god emperor that is gonna do
Yes.
terrible things to Siri and disrespect her as a person and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And he's honestly quite very innocent. And like when you think about how
Yes.
innocent he is, he has a childlike innocence. So Siri has to become the one who has to protect him
Yeah.
and try to teach him about the world. But
Yeah.
there's still that inherent power differential. Um, so like they're both kind of on edge at the beginning and like I really like I remember thinking when I was reading it I was like I think I actually am like wanting these two to end up together which is just
Yeah.
pretty rare for me so
That I felt the same thing. And it's interesting that you mentioned Dalinar and Navani because I also really appreciate Dalinar and Navani, but that I appreciate because it's an older couple in fantasy or in general. Like, that's not something that we get a lot of the time in literature, especially
Also,
in
it starts
fantasy.
super clunky. It is not well handled to
It
begin
is
with.
very
Like
clunky in the
she's
beginning.
literally like a Pepe Le Pew character. Whenever time
Yes.
he comes in and she's like ooga ooga, and it's like, can you just chill? Like Dalinar's just trying to talk about bread or something. So
I mean, how could you not be that way with Dalinar Colin? But that's a whole other conversation. But in terms of the Ciri and Susebron relationship, I really liked that. And when you're looking at it from the lens of comparing it to how Vivenna and Susebron would have been, it would have been such a horrific pairing because Vivenna, for
terrible
3/4 of this book, is the
is the
worst.
worst.
Like the
When
absolute worst.
when my wife was reading the book, she was just talking about how much she didn't like Vivenna, and I was like, interesting, interesting.
Yep,
And then
exactly.
like she got
Taking
to the
notes.
point where
Taking notes.
she's like, oh, she got humbled. She has to be homeless now, and she was all pumped. And afterwards, she's like, I think I like her. And I'm like, yep,
This was
that's exactly
100% my journey with Vivenna, because when I was reading it the first time, I was messaging Bookborn because it's also her favorite Cosmere book, and I was saying, does Vivenna stop sucking at any point in this book? Because so far, I just hate her, and her chapters make me want to rip my hair out. And Bookworm was saying, I actually really love her character arc. Wait until the end and tell me what you think when you get to the end of the book. And when she's homeless, I was like, finally, girl is getting humbled, and I'm so here for this. Oh my gosh. I don't think I've ever done such a dramatic 180 on a singular character in one book. Like, I've done it in the course of multiple books, but it's like half a book that I changed my opinion on Vivenna. And it doesn't go from me thinking she's the worst to the absolute best, but I genuinely found her a redeemable character by the end of the story.
Not only that, like where we see her in Stormlight, because we've now kind of gone into Stormlight spoilers.
Yeah.
She's grown quite a bit in that time too.
So much.
So for me, it's like I actively disliked her. I accepted it was like A+ character growth, but I still didn't really like her. And then I like
Yeah.
her in Stormlight, or at least what we've seen of
Yeah.
her so far. So I'm like, okay, so there's
Exactly.
like a very interesting development going on here, and
It's
I really
super
want to see how
weird,
that
and I
goes.
agree because you look at it and you go, "Hey, Evie, we'll take your trolling comments all the time."
Evie, get out of here. Go learn about nobody.
It's so fascinating because I assume there's a pretty significant gap of time between Warbreaker and Stormlight,
We
and
don't have any way of knowing, I don't
we
think.
don't know, and that's
Yeah.
the thing, but obviously there has been such dramatic character growth for Vivenna that I assume anyway, that there has been significant periods of time that have passed. And it's interesting to me, like, I remember reading it and thinking, I was like, Vivenna is going to be a world hopper when I was reading it, and I was like, and I'm going to get stuck with this chick forever, because it seemed very clear Ciri and Susebron are going to be end game for each other, and their storyline will likely be concluded in this book. Light Song, you knew, because there was so much emphasis on him taking the breath every week and not wanting to do it. I was like, Light Song is going to bite it at some point in this book, even though it breaks my heart. Like, it's coming. And I was like, that leaves us with Basher and Vivenna, who are definitely going to be hopping around the Cosmere in some way, shape, or form.
I don't believe that you called that. I think this is you retroactively trying to convince me you're smart.
This was
I don't
not
believe
me
this.
retroactively saying it, because I knew, and I didn't know who, but people had said there are characters in this
Oh,
book
okay.
that become world hoppers.
Then I get you. Okay.
So
Yeah.
it was one of those things that I didn't go into it and I was like, oh, like, I know all this stuff. It was because of that forewarning that I was on the lookout, kind of trying to suss out who I thought it would be. And those two seemed like the most sense. I was also going to be devastated if something happened to Nightblood along the way. I was like, I don't want anybody if they don't have Nightblood. But the story begins, right, where we have these two cities that are at war with each other. And this is the underlying problem in the story, is that you have Idris and Taltalir, and Taltalir is where Susebron is from, and the Court of the Gods, the Returned with Light Song. And then Idris is this really bland place comparatively. When you think of
I just
Taltalir,
imagine it like made with wooden posts and they like
Right?
sleep in tents. Like I know that's not what
Yes.
actually happened, but that's like in comparison to how like the big
Yeah.
city is. That's what I just
Mhm.
imagine.
I just pictured everything being gray. Like, everything was
Yeah.
made of, like, gray stone, and it was quiet, and there wasn't really much going on, and then when I picture Teltalier, I'm like, color, flowers, like, warmth, sunshine, people in the streets, like, that it was just night and day difference. I love that it surprised you, Caleb. I am really glad that it surprised you, but
I think
what
I'm
did you
kind of in
think?
the middle. Like I don't think
Okay,
I thought that he was going to die for sure, but I was like, oh, they're laying this on. Like I wouldn't be surprised. At the time though, like I didn't know Sanderson's writing style very well, so like you
fair.
don't know. It's harder to predict with an author you're unfamiliar with, but
Mhm.
yeah, I wasn't
I
shocked. I loved
That's
his ending
fair.
though. Loved it.
I feel like I might not have been as clued into that had I not just finished Mistborn and seen how he treats certain characters at the end of Mistborn, and I was like, "Oh, okay, like anybody's kind of fair game." So,
Yeah.
um, and I felt pretty solid in the fact that because he had already technically died once, I was like, he's likely gonna die again, especially because he seems like he doesn't really want to be alive again anyway. He seems like the most likely candidate, which is unfortunate. But what did you think in terms of looking back on it as a reread, setting like our world setting for Nalthis? Is it one of your favorites, kind of mid, don't really care about it?
I
Like, what do you
really
think?
like the setting, but so the thing for me, this is my hottest Sanderson take. Yes, Jake, Warbreaker is all
Hey,
right.
Jake.
Is that I like Sanderson is my favorite author. I've read almost all of his books. Really, really love him, and I'm just not a really big magic person. Not to say that I don't think he writes cool magic, like he does. But if I was to remove an element out of most of my favorite books, it would most usually be the magic. Like it's just not what
Okay.
makes things special to me. So setting like was good, and I really like the magic system. I think it's very interesting.
Mhm.
Um, but I think none of that, like to me, it's just like the characters and the plot and stuff. And I thought on the reread it would be way more boring because in my head I was like, the book is pretty slow, and you're waiting until the Denth and Tok'ra reveal, and then things kind of like you get the table pulled out from under you, and then things kind of speed up. And I thought like the first half would be slow, and I just love the whole book. Like I
I
don't
do
think like
too.
when people say it's slow and they're like, oh yeah, like it's just kind of like boring talking. I'm like, but it's the best type of talking. Like I don't know.
That's what my
I was
husband
pleasantly
said, and I was
surprised.
like, "No, no, it's still good." He's like, "It's so slow," and I was like, "I love all of it. It's all great."
Also, because I had like my wife in my head being like, Light Song's not funny, because this was her description of Light Song. Because I know that my wife is not the one doing this stream, but it just was funny to me because she was like, Light Song was just walking around like, I can't juggle. I don't know how to farm. I don't know. And I'm like, yeah, but that's hysterical. Like, you know, like he's
Mhm.
just like trying out all the things. And like
All the things. Exactly.
the
She
like
and Josh
grand
had the
reveal.
same opinions on Light Song, like the exact same opinions. That's hilarious.
And like the grand reveal of that, like, so first of all, I think it logically makes sense. If you decide that you're trying to figure out who you were, because the way he figures out, like, it totally, the character through line totally works for me. He's like,
Yeah.
wait a second, I have muscle memory of a thing that I don't have, I shouldn't know. So therefore, I keep some of my memories. So therefore, by process of elimination, I can start to figure out who I was
Yeah.
before. And that
Mhm.
is like top tier thinking. None of these other gods are on his level. And then he starts processing of elimination. So what if you have to learn that he can't juggle? He's trying shit out. Maybe he was a juggler. And then
Mhm.
at the end, when like his brother just reveals that you know, he was just like a boring tax guy or whatever, and he had to like find out when people
Is it an
were like,
accountant?
yeah, yeah, an accountant. And I was like, this is the perfect ending to this. And his brother's just
Yeah.
like, you're such an idiot. I was
Mhm.
like, 10 out of
I
10
loved it.
reveal.
I I felt the same way. For me, as soon as you have a divine character that doesn't believe in their own divinity, I'm so in. I thought that premise alone was so funny that I was immediately endeared to him. I really felt like the relationship between Blushweaver and Lightsong was highly reinforced by the fact that Brandon was on his honeymoon when he wrote this book.
The relationship, I think just like her description.
Her descriptors. But a lot of the banter between the two of them is much more provocative than
Way more.
any
Sanderson was
any
on some
other
shit.
Sanderson book. Yeah. So that honestly really took me by surprise when I read it the first time because I had just finished
Oh,
Mistborn, which is not explicit, and then you get into Warbreaker, and I was like, "What is happening?"
I'm listening to you. I'm just going to go find the comment I left in the Discord. Keep talking.
Yeah, it was just completely a surprise that that kind of language made its way into a Sanderson novel. I personally didn't mind it because I found that it fit very well with Blushweaver, and I liked the dynamic between her and Lightsong, and that it was very flirtatious and it was salacious at times, but Lightsong simultaneously wasn't super interested. That to me was very entertaining, and that he was more focused on his discovery and detective quest.
I totally agree. I have to share this funny story with you because I think it's the funniest thing about this read. Do you mind if I swear on here, or do you want me to not
I do
swear?
not mind. No, go
Okay.
ahead.
So Sanderson is known for being very squeaky clean, to the annoyance of some people, and he makes fake swears, which we all meme on. And I was listening to the audiobook part of it, and I speed up audiobooks, but like I usually don't have an issue like ever understanding what a person says. And
Same.
and Light Song is talking about how he's like down about something, and Blushweaver just casually says, "Do you want to go back to the room and frolic or something like that?" And I heard her say, "Do you want to go back to the room and fuck?" And I was like, Sanderson, what is going on? And I paused it and I turned down the speed on my audiobook way down, and I
Yeah.
re-listened to it, and I still heard fuck. And I'm like, this son of a bitch. I was like, he was crazy. He was wilding out for this book. And then I went and I picked up my physical copy, and I was like, oh, he said frolic.
Yeah. 100%. I actually had that exact moment with that part in the book too, because I also listen to things at an increased speed. And there were a few moments in this book that I had to go back and I was like, oh, okay, we're not as explicit. But then I remembered when I was reading it the first time, I was like, I know his descriptors get pretty vivid, but there's not really like the act upon it isn't as
Yeah.
clear cut in that way, shape, or
Also,
form.
like Blushcleaver, like she's a very provocative character, and I feel like because she's such a juxtaposition to how he normally writes women and
Yes.
writes in general, we all talk about that more when we talk about that character. And I'm
Yeah.
sure Sanderson now would write her differently, but I do think underneath that, she's actually still a really good character
I
because
love Blush Weaver.
like you think that she's manipulating Lightsong to get what she wants, and you think that you're like she's gonna be this like kind of I had her pegged as like gonna be revealed to be a bad guy,
Yeah,
and
I did too the
she's
first
actually
time.
just like actually genuine, and she's really trying to help with stuff, and she like
Yeah.
has genuine affection for Light Song, and she
Yeah.
just expresses it in this like over the top way. And I thought her death was like really affecting, and how it like motivated Light Song to like
Oh, completely.
actually get stuff done and everything. So
I mean, without Blush Weaver's death, the events of the end don't happen
yeah,
because it's just Susan Braun and Siri kind of getting screwed over and not in a fun way. But the whole relationship dynamic between the gods in general was something that I found really interesting. Like the god court and how they are part of a religion where they don't even really know the head of their religion. Like there are so many parallels to actual religions in this book and like themes from religion that to me just made so much sense, and then we're also very funny because of that. um Having all the different priests and having a very secular sect with the Idrians basically being, very conforming and conservative. And then you have all of them in the God Court that are like boobs hanging out, cleavage everywhere. Like it's great. Everyone's having a good time. We're all just eating grapes and drinking wine, but not getting drunk and playing disc golf on the lawn. Like I just loved
it's very
that
meow 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 beans.
exactly. I love that this was how gods were spending their time because if you read mythology, I'm like, this is 100% how gods would be spending their time, like without question. So
Mhm.
when you get into the nitty gritty of Lightsong actually caring, that is when the story really, in my opinion, starts taking off because you're getting all of the background context. I feel like at that point, it's really relationships that are forming up until that point, and then that's when the ball gets rolling, and we're like, okay, no, we're gonna start figuring out what the background motivations are here. But when you read it the first time, did you see the Vivenna getting duped by the mercenaries?
Absolutely not. Some
Okay,
people think
I
it's
did
so
not
obvious,
either.
and I'm like, how? Like, it should
I
be.
didn't see it
That's the
either.
genius of the reveal is that Sanderson, like in hindsight, you're like, well, of course these are bad guys. I've been saying it the whole time, but you're just like, oh, but they're just like the endearing little mercenaries,
Exactly.
you know? Oh, did you pick up on either while you're reading or like maybe here afterwards that oh, I'm blanking on the dead guy's name. The
Claude,
lifeless Claude. That Claude is Arsteal. Did you pick up on that?
say that again. Claude, what?
Claude is Arsteal, like one of the five Ardents or whatever. He's
I did
friends with.
not.
Yeah, so I didn't pick up on that on my first read either. I heard about that after the fact. So on reread, that was interesting to catch because the girl was in love with Arsteal, and like the whole book, Dent is being mad at Vasher. He's like, "How could you ever have bested Arsteal? Like he was the best. He was the
Okay.
best." And then Claude has like some muscle memory of being like a fighter, and they say that they retain a little bit. So he's like the best of the lifeless.
Gotcha.
And then at the end, like also that reveal when like Vasher like gives him his breath and then stabs him. Vasher's the shit.
I love Vasher so very much, and I love all versions of Vasher that we have encountered in the Cosmere. I think that they're all great, but I did not catch the R Steel thing. But I was also completely taken by surprise when they duped Vivenna. I thought it was very much that we were bad before, but you're paying us, so now we'll be bad for you. And then
Yeah.
when they screwed her, I was like, oh, okay, that got me. But it's so necessary to the plot because up until that point, you want to just jump in the book and strangle Vivenna because she's the absolute
Yeah, I also think that's the moment where the book really takes off. Like, I mean, it's not like I don't think the first half was good, but that's like the reveal where you're like, oh,
yeah,
we don't know what's going on here, and there's more
right,
to the story.
exactly. So, in terms of key moments of this book for you, what was it on the first read, and did that change for you on the reread?
Um, I so I don't remember my first read of this book super well. Like, actually, so one thing I will say is, I remember this book extremely well. Like I've reread books plenty of times in my life, and like some of them, you know, like Words of Radiance, I remember that whole book too. But
Because
I
it's
thought I would have,
fire.
yeah, I just thought I would
So
have forgotten
good.
more of this book, and I honestly like I forgot like almost nothing except for like things I had no context for, obviously.
Sure.
Um, so on reread, that aspect of it like didn't change. Where I was like, oh, like this has way more significance for me. But I did appreciate Vivenna's character arc more on reread, and I did really like Susebron a lot more on reread because I knew right from the beginning what the deal was with him, and so I was kind of
Yeah.
watching his behavior and everything. So it was more just like knowing where the reveals were going. On
Yeah.
first read, the main thing I remember was Ciri and Susebron's relationship, Vivenna in the streets, and the end with Lightsong. Like those were like the three kind of pillars of the story to me. Maybe
Thanks,
the
Mitch.
Pickwick Papers. Mitch,
We like Warbreaker, so too bad.
all these haters coming out of the woodwork.
Exactly. I also really enjoyed reading this with the perspective of knowing the reveals. I thought it was really interesting. And I was a little worried about that, honestly, because so much of the first read through experience is experiencing those reveals. And I thought, is it going to be.
You also read it way sooner. Like it's been 3.5
Yes.
years for me, and it was like
I read it
less than a
less
year.
than a year before. So I read it last February and then read it this January. So it was close to a year, but still less. And I actually really liked reading back on it with the perspective of going, okay, I know that these guys are going to screw over Vivenna. I'm looking at this very differently. I know what's going on with Susebron now. How am I going to view the relationship between him and Ciri? Am I going to view it any differently? And it was so interesting because the first time when you read through it and Ciri is kind of just put in front of him and she's thinking, okay, we're gonna have sex now, and he's like just sitting there, and you as the reader are going, what is he doing? And now you look back on it and you're like, he had no idea what he was doing.
For sure. Also, her jumping up and down on the bed and making moaning noises, and
So good.
him just like having no idea what's going on is peak comedy. The first time
Yeah.
it's funny, like
Yeah.
it's just like a naturally funny thing to happen. But like when you have full context of how Sue Safran is,
It's
I just
hilarious.
feel like it was so much funnier. In
It's
general, this is
hilarious.
probably the funniest Sanderson book for me. I think it's the funniest
For
for
me,
me
it's the
personally.
funniest,
Yeah.
without question. I liked Hoyd's humor in Trust. There is one scene that I do not like in Trust, but other than that, I liked all of the humor in Trust. But for just straight up humor across the book for multiple different characters, I really like Warbreaker. I feel that scene is a perfect example of great humor that isn't through conversation, it's through action, which I really enjoyed. And then, of course, Light Song and Nightblood are hilarious the whole way through. And then I enjoyed the mercenaries too. I thought that they were funny at times. So
Yeah.
overall, very good humor. But our main world hopper makes an appearance in Warbreaker, as he does in most books, and he is called Hoyd in this book, which I appreciate because you and I have discussed this, and we hate his name in Stormlight so much because it's stupid.
It's not that I hate it. It makes sense in book one, but then they still call him that later. I'm like, this is no longer he is not this anymore.
Exactly.
Like,
it's ridiculous. Just call him Hoyd, but whatever. I really like his interaction with Ciri in this book. What do you think of our Hoyd guest appearance in Warbreaker?
Mostly, I just wish that Sanderson had balls back then and just like made this more like. It's not like I needed like a full Hoyd, but like Hoyd is so clearly like he's talked about this before, where he like wanted to really drip dry Hoyd and the Cosmere in because he was afraid people wouldn't like it, and obviously he would not have known that it would have become a big thing that everybody loved. But I just wish he had just went for it a little bit earlier. I'm not saying making this a full Cosmere blown novel, but you don't really get a Hoyd personality. You get a guy named Hoyd that's a storyteller, and you can see he's doing like he has the quintessential Hoyd element of like being a storyteller. So he's still Hoyd. But I'm like, man, like if Sanderson just like released the book again and changed nothing about the book except that Hoyd part, I feel like the book would like that chapter would be way better.
So how would you change it? What would you have him do?
Just act Hoydier. Like, I don't know, like just talk more. Like, I feel like later on, Hoyd, like every time he appears in Stormlight, especially in the early books, he's talking to somebody, trying to suss them out, see if they're more Cosmere aware. He's offering cryptic hints, you know, he's trying to like help them. Like, you can see he has an ulterior goal he's not sharing with them. And then in like Mistborn and this, he's just like, yeah, so 100 years ago there was some stuff. And then they did some stuff, and then thanks for talking to me about the stuff.
Yeah. So Hoyd in Stormlight, they're in books 1 and 2. In book 1, the Hoyd scene with Kaladin is my favorite scene in Way of Kings because I love the story that he tells Kaladin. Like, I'm always down for a really good Hoyd story, so I appreciate that about Hoyd. But I agree, he feels a bit tame here compared to how we've seen him since then. And I always wonder too with Hoyd, because we get such different versions of him depending on who he's speaking to, right? Like the way he speaks to Shallan is not the way he speaks to Yasna, and it's not the way he speaks to Kaladin, it's not the way he speaks to Ciri.
And probably why he's so endearing is that he's very multifaceted.
Right? He's super multifaceted. He knows who he's talking to. Yeah, that is a Cosmere connection. He's doing Yolish light weaving. So I don't know if it would change all that much in terms of if Sanderson were to redo this chapter, just based on him interacting with Ciri, because Ciri in so many ways is so innocent and has been thrust into this situation where she knows absolute nothing.
So to be clear, it's not like I want him to like recruit her into like, well, I'm just talking about like if you were to read all of the Cosmere as one giant story, you know how like in early books or early movies in a series, there's like, well, like the first pilot episode of a TV show, characters don't act like in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Rosa's voice is super different in season 1, and then she changes her voice in season 2, and then you go back and it's super jarring. That's kind of what I mean, where it's like the tone of Hoyd he just hadn't figured out yet. And so like Hoyd, I just feel like acts differently with people now, but like that's fine. Like it's not like
Yeah,
a criticism. But I would have wished if like he had fleshed out Hoyt's character a little bit more by the time he
I
did
hear
this.
you.
But it's just not how it went. So
So Sanderson started writing a Hoyd backstory book where he uses the powers he uses in Warbreaker more extensively. There used to be several chapters on his website, but they're gone now. Interesting. I
well,
wonder if those will.
I'll save you one better, Daniel. That is called Dragonsteel, and he's releasing that whole book next month.
Yeah.
Or, well, not next month, but it's part of the Words of Radiance Kickstarter that starts March 1st or March 15th or whatever. So,
Of
like
course.
Way of Kings Prime, you can get the Dragonsteel Prime, and you can read that book. But
Which I won't be getting. So, oh well.
you're not gonna get it.
No.
You don't want to sell a liver or.
No. I like the leather bounds in theory, but from everything I've seen from people who have them, they're like, you can't really read them.
Oh, I didn't read. I could have read this. I just it's big is really the only reason. Like, look at how pretty this is. This is
I
so
don't
pretty.
disagree. I think it's beautiful on the inside. Ben read his for our read through,
Yeah.
and yeah, I've just seen a lot of people say like when they've started reading it, like stuff has started coming off and things like that. And I'm like, I want to be able to enjoy the fancy books that I buy. So I could buy 2 nice medium books for one price of the other ones. But all right, I'm glad that you read it, Jake. Was nice.
Jake is for sure in the camp of I read my special editions. I think the only ones I'm going to get are the 5 Stormlight and then Warbreaker, because I feel like Warbreaker is a prequel anyway. And then
yeah,
I'm not getting Mistborn. Like,
I feel like I might get one when we go to Dragonsteel, just as kind of like a commemorative. Oh, I went to Dragonsteel. Like, here's my nice book. And the one I would get would be Warbreaker. Because I don't want to get one of the Stormlight Archive books and then not.
Yeah, Warbreaker is a good one to have as a standalone. I don't know if I'm going to back the Kickstarter because I know that like we can get Words of Radiance later. So like, I don't know.
Exactly. It's one of those things that it's going to be available, so I'm not super worried about it. But okay, so the story kind of gets moving. All the stuff behind the scenes is happening. What do you think of the super in-depth magic system that he gives us for Warbreaker? Because at one point he literally gives a breakdown that felt very scientific of like, this tightening is this tightening is this.
I think people overthink this kind of stuff. I think it's cool. Like I understand both sides. Like if you love the deep, in-depth magic system and you want all the details, I get it. And if you just like want magic to remain mysterious, and you think Sanderson kind of takes away from that, like I get it. But I do think people talk about it too much as an overall. Like that scene. I know exactly what scene you're talking about, but ultimately it's one, like maybe 2 pages max in the whole book. And it just sticks out in people's memory. And I feel that's the same way about Rhythm of War, where people are talking about, wow, it just goes so in depth. And I am literally going to tab all the times he goes in depth in Rhythm of War, my reread, because it's not as much as people think. And so
it's not so bad. I just read it, and it's nowhere near as bad as people were playing it up to be, to me anyway.
It's really not. And it's one thing to say like, oh, I don't like it felt like it dragged me. That's like a subjective experience. But to be like, oh, he spent a bunch of the book talking about this is just like factually not true. So that's why I'm gonna get the facts. Which is a different
Go ahead. Yeah.
This is just a lead up to say that I really like the magic system in Warbreaker, and I think at a certain point, the reader, it behooves them to know more about the heightenings. And so like getting that information is valuable. I don't think you need to keep onto it to understand the story. Like people try and like hold on, and same with Mistborn. They try and like hold every detail, and like you'll get the parts you need to get.
I feel like in terms of magic systems, I really like the Warbreaker magic system. It's probably my favorite just because breath and color for some reason in my brain makes perfect sense with each other. When I read it the first time, I sat back and thought, why has no one done that before? Like this just makes such sense in my brain.
I have something to remind me after we get off live. I have something to tell you related to breath. I don't want to share it on screen, but it's a funny story. But yeah, no, I love the breath stuff. I think it's very, very good. I like it more than Stormlight.
Nothing. Go ahead. What were you saying?
I like it more than Stormlight. I don't know if I like it more than Mistborn. It's about similar.
I do like it more than Mistborn, and that was what I was going to say. I found reading Mistborn to be a little bit tedious in that I found at that point, and I don't know if it's because it's earlier in his career, that it felt like he didn't trust the reader to remember things and he just kept repeating them. And I was like, I get that it is an extensive magic system, Brandon, but have some faith in us. Like, come on. And with Warbreaker, I was like, okay, it's in depth. The very first chapter, our intro to Vasher, kind of gives some of the breakdown with it. And I was like, cool, I'm in. I get it. And then there's really not that much explaining it until much later in the book. And I liked that, as opposed to in Mistborn, it felt like anytime Vin or Kelsier go outside, we're getting a super lengthy list of all the things that metals do.
Well, so the very beginning of Mistborn, I know this isn't a Mistborn chat, but the very beginning of Mistborn, where it's like super technical and Kelsier's fighting all those dudes, terrible to read.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think it's like he talked about trying to strike a balance, and I think that's fair. Like you might be a reader that like, oh, I remember this, but there's tons of readers that need that reminder.
I know
so
that's
it's actually like very helpful for them. So like I agree.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that people, because it bothers them, they don't tend to be like, well, actually, I can see why this helps a lot of people.
And that's the thing. I know that that's the case. It's just I don't need it. So for me, like I found myself glazing over it a lot of the time with Mistborn, not with
Laura. Let me ask you a question. Did you need to know all of the food descriptions in A Song of Ice and Fire? Because I didn't. And you know what I did? I just stopped reading them. I just moved on. Do you need to know? Do you need to know a description of every naked person's body in A Song of Ice and Fire? No, you don't. So you just skip it. You just move on. You just become an expert at moving past things, and that's what I do in the Mistborn.
Glazing over, exactly. And that became a lot of it for me. But with Warbreaker, I never really found that. I was like, oh, I'm genuinely intrigued to see how this works. And the magic system as a whole has later Cosmere implications. Like we're learning later in Stormlight about some of the stuff that the magic from Nalthis can do, and how they're
how far did you get into Sunlight Man?
Very early, like a few chapters.
Okay.
Yeah,
there's cool Warbreaker magic-y things in that book.
Okay, so I have that to look forward to. I wasn't vibing with it, so I'll get back to it at some point. But all in all, the magic from Warbreaker is important for our greater Cosmere implications, which is something that I found to be quite interesting. I would think in general that most of the magic in the Cosmere, like any magic from a book, has had big implications. But with something that's really interesting to me is that Elantris has had crazy implications later. What are you talking about?
Not as much as the other ones, though.
Oh, I strongly disagree. I was just going to say the exact opposite.
Elantris has had like 2 boxes show up. That's it.
I don't think so, but I do think it's interesting that for books that were standalones, that there have been lasting implications. Like the magic, I would say, is definitely more important from Nalthis than it is from Sel. But you have...
That's what I just said.
Well, I'm getting to my next point now. It's connected. And I was going to say... But it's interesting to me simultaneously that you have had these Elantrians show up in varied time periods and on different worlds. So like both stories, even though they've been standalones, have had very widespread Cosmere implications, even though they're not the most in-your-face thing, but they're really fun to see on a reread, and you go, oh, okay, maybe that's what that is, and that's how that can affect that later. But like we were saying earlier, it's not something that, oh, you have to read Warbreaker first to then appreciate what you've read later. It's just a fun little added bonus if you have read it, and when you reread it, it can completely enhance it even more. Elantris changed entirely when the Lost Metal came out. Everything going on in the background is different when you know that Jaddeth is Jaddeth. Yeah, that is a big deal.
Yeah, I'm not saying Elantris doesn't have Cosmere connections. Like it does, and I think the sequels are going to really lean into that. I'm just saying the magic system specifically of Sel has not like gone out as much as I would say that the main 3 magic systems in the Cosmere are the Roshar and Scadrial and
Nalthis. I would agree. With just Elantrians kind of showing up being like, hey, and little scenes and stuff.
Man, so, like I'm so excited for Warbreaker when we get it in 35 years. But I have to say, Elantris 2 is going to be a really, really interesting experience. because he'll be a
I
much
am
better
excited.
writer by that time.
So I actually, this is not a Cosmere chat, but I'm going to talk about it anyway.
It's just how it's become. It is what it is.
It is what it is. I actually really enjoy Elantris. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as people like to pick it out.
No, I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's a great book, and I'm genuinely really excited to see what he does with sequels there. I'm curious to see if we have a time jump with those sequels, or
Do
if
you
it's
know
like,
who the main character is supposed to be?
no, I do not.
Have you read Mistborn Era 2?
Yes, I have. So why am I blanking on this?
Code names. I don't want to say more just because, like, I'll tell you after,
Okay.
but
Yes,
like
I know
Code
what you're
names is the
saying.
main character. Yeah, okay.
Okay. So that's fine. But I am excited to go back into that world and get more of that. And I mean, with Warbreaker, it's interesting because when I finished it the first time, I thought, oh, I don't know if I really want more. Like when I finished Elantris, I did really want more. I was like, I feel like there's a lot more to be told here. But with Warbreaker, I felt like it was a good conclusion to the
I'm
story.
the
But
complete opposite.
that's so funny because I felt like there were certain characters I was interested in, but for me, because I knew Lightsong wasn't going to be a part of a sequel, I was like, it's done. It's
Pass.
good.
No, see, I think every so Nightblood is supposed to only follow Bastard, Nightblood, and
Yes.
Ravenna, but I think the whole book, like, I want to know what happens in the city after them. Like, I think there's a lot of interesting things you could explore from the
Mhm.
aftermath. And I get, like, he has so many other things he has to do. I understand why he
Yeah.
doesn't want to do sequels to every little thread.
Sure.
And it is a good capstone for like Theory and Susubran, and like now they get their happily ever after.
Right.
Like, I understand, but I
Yeah.
do think there's a lot of things you could do with that setting from now.
Mhm.
So
I
I'm
agree. I
sad that
mean,
we're not going to see them again.
I personally, this is my little hot take. I don't love the Cosmere novellas other than Emperor's Soul. Emperor's Soul is a 5-star read, but I wish that I will keep talking to everybody else here. I wish that instead of working on novellas, we were getting something like a sequel or, a story
Do you know
on.
how quickly he pops out those novellas? That's not even like a fair statement. Also, he hasn't written one in a long time. We
I
need
don't
that rock
care.
novella. I'm gonna come to your house and fight you. How
I
dare you
don't
stop me
like
from getting it?
them. I
The
just don't
rock
like them.
novella is so cool in theory. I mean, it's not written yet, but
No, Dawn Shard, first of all, isn't a novella because it's so friggin' long. And then Lift's novella is Lift. So
you know
that's
what
a whole
though?
other
So
thing.
I agree with you, but I heard Christopher Rocchio say recently. This is a tangent upon a tangent. That they're like his new novella, Dregs of Empire, is actually a novel, but that he calls them novellas because otherwise people think they have to read them in order, and so it's like the novels are the main things, and if you call them a novella, then people know that there's side things. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. So now I get why Sanderson calls them a novella, even though I'm like, Sendo, those are novels, but I get it now.
Yeah, Dawn Shard was a full-on book, but that's besides the point. So what do you think of the overall ending of Warbreaker? Because if we're talking about his other early works, which would be Elantris and Mistborn Era 1, I really hate the ending of Elantris because it's super rushed. And
I
I
agree.
feel like I'm in the minority opinion that I don't really love the ending of Mistborn Era 1. But I really like the end of Warbreaker. It's probably my
So
favorite end of a book.
your opinion on Hero of Ages is a crime. We will be taking you to court for this. I mean, I'm in the middle. Like, I think it's a good ending. I think it could have used more time. I also, and like, this, like, so Bookborn had Leanna from Leanna's library read this book, and she famously doesn't like Sanderson very much.
Oh,
And
I
she
know. I watched
also,
that live stream.
yeah. So for anybody who didn't watch it, so um, you know, Leanna hates everything. I've said this to her, is that whenever she reads a book, there's like a minefield, and she doesn't know, and we don't know what mine is she's gonna hit. But if she hits mine, it's a 1-star book, and you don't know what's gonna set her off. And so I expected her to hate Warbreaker, and she actually almost liked it, but the end was what really, really just like killed it for her. And unfortunately, she raised some really good points, and I was like very aware of that on my reread, which is that it's like the oppressed group that becomes like the villains at the end,
Mhm.
and it's like they're treated as like the bad people, even though they've been like oppressed by this nation and displaced and everything. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think Sanderson intended to do that, but I get that as a point of contention.
Sure.
So
I don't even really think about that, honestly, when I'm thinking about the ending, which is kind of crazy. Like when I'm thinking about the conclusion of the end, I think, okay, we have the reveal of Vasher as Warbreaker, which I really love that scene. I then think of the fight between him and I can't remember which
Den,
mercenary it is, Denth.
Den.
And I love that. And Nightblood kind of being with Vivenna, which I thought was
Yeah.
hilarious. But really the culmination of the end for me, which is so poignant, is Light Song. That for me
Yes,
is
I love that part.
the key pinnacle of the end. So I get completely what she's saying in that context, but I don't even really think of that as being like the ending. I think of the individual decisions that each character kind of makes in that moment. And obviously with the death of Blush Weaver, we were talking about this before, her death is unfortunately very necessary to the plot to motivate Lightsong, but Lightsong's revelation and journey with himself is so fascinating to me. And his relationship with his brother, aka his priest, which you find out at that point that they're brothers, was really moving to
I
me
agree.
because
When
it's
he's like, you're a great man, or you're a god to
yeah,
me.
like
I'm like,
it
oh man.
it was a really well done scene for me. It made me think too, like, how weird would it be to be in the position of the brother, right? Where you can't tell him any of this, but you know him so intimately and you know all these details and
And he's just
you
saying
yourself
tomfoolery every day, and you're just like,
yeah,
oh.
and like you yourself are striving to find meaning within your faith and this is what you've been presented with. Like it was so layered and convoluted for me that I really their dynamic was probably my favorite from the book. I really enjoyed it. But that final scene for Light Song I thought was such a beautiful
Yeah,
moment.
brought me to tears. So
Yeah, I love it.
um, it really got me. Also, can you highlight Daniel's comment about the Sunlit Man? Because I have to address this.
Is it this one?
Yes. So
Okay.
I heard this today. I was catching up on Lost of Roshar, and Jimmy and Christian said basically this. And I listened. I had already watched this Sanderson video, so I don't know where people are getting this from, and I really don't think it's correct. He has never referred to it as a novella. First of all, it is straight up a novel. What he says in that beginner's guide is that he's like, you can start with the secret projects. You can do this one or this one. You really shouldn't do Sunlit Man until after Stormlight 4. And then he goes on to the next thing. It's not like he's saying it is specifically in sequences that he's like, yeah, it's kind of intended to be read at this time. But it's not a novella. And the Rock novella is being moved just because he hasn't written it. But I still think that like that timeline is still going to be at the place it's always supposed to be. So he's still going to have it slotted in the timeline there. So I think people are freaking out about this for no reason. I just think he kind of used strange phrasing when trying to explain quickly about something. I don't think we need to worry about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Rock novella is now officially in the timeline, right? For his
Well, yeah, but
projected
the
project.
time is it's supposed to be taking place during the fourth book. It's
I see
just that
what you
he's
mean.
not going
Okay.
to write it for a long time.
I got what you're saying. Okay. Um, it's not that video.
Okay, I know what you're talking about, but I disagree. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. It's just that it's not a novella, so it's like a
That's
full
fine.
blown novel.
So, end of the book, we have Light Song's big sacrifice in that he chooses to give his one and only breath to Susebron, who reemerges victoriously with the tongue. So now he can do and say all of the things. Now, Josh asked me this earlier today, and I didn't quite know how to answer him. So I'm gonna ask you, and maybe you'll be able to put it together
Oh
better
no,
than
on the
I did.
spot.
Yeah, so get ready. Susebron obviously has like all this crazy amount of breath. I mean, yes,
Touche, Daniel.
Daniel, touche. Susebron has like 50,000 breaths, this obscene amount of breath, right? That no one else has, can do all of these insane things with it. So, in order to call his power, his tongue is cut out. Do you think that he was given any sort of formal training on what his breath could do if he had a tongue by his priest after his tongue has been cut out?
Why would they do that?
Then how does he know how to awaken things once he's been given his tongue? This this is
Does
the question
he
that Josh posed to
does
me, and
he
I was like,
say things does he say, like, how to awaken stuff, or does he, just do it, like, in his head?
"That's the thing.
No,
I
like, I
don't
actually don't
know,
remember.
because I don't know." And I was saying to Josh, I was like, "I think he just has so much breath that he doesn't really have to, like,
Yeah,
do the
I
same."
think it's kind of like, in, like, Harry Potter where, like, the early people need to say it out loud, but then, like, when you're a really good wizard, you can just kinda do stuff, and then,
Think
like,
it?
yeah,
Yeah,
also, there was, like, a lot of time that passed while Siri was training him and stuff and, like, teaching him history and stuff. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch. At some point, he was like, "Do you know how my powers work?" He's, like, writing it down. "Do you know how my powers work?" And she was like, "Yeah, I see them out there in the streets. What they do
right.
is they say words and they make commands." And then he just kinda figured it out from there. Like,
Yeah,
it
I
it
mean,
it seems
entirely
like Josh
possible.
was not liking the book, so he was trying to give you a gotcha. Uh, and like I'm saying, just, divorce papers, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, he asked me that question earlier today, and I was like, "I'm pretty sure it's just because 'cause he's got so much biochromatic breath
Yeah, I
that
think
dude
so
can do
too.
whatever he wants."
But you know
But
what? Is
okay.
is Josh coming to Dragonsteel?
Yeah.
Okay, he can just ask Sanderson. He can be like, "I got you." And then if Sanderson doesn't have a good answer, then
I
then we
demand
got.
answers for the 2 books that I've read of yours. Tell me now. Oh,
See, I
man, but
agree with
yeah,
Daniel. I think it's just instinctive. Like he's just so powerful.
I think so too. Exactly. Oh, man. At extreme levels of investiture, you gain instinctive knowledge. That's true. That is true. Investiture does a lot of different things, and we don't quite know exactly what this restorative breath did for him other than give him a tongue. So could be that he's gotten all kinds of other stuff too as well, which brings us kind of to the end of the story where everything sort of wraps up in a semi neat little bow.
What did you think
Um,
about the reveal that the like statues were like the the lifeless or whatever, like
I
the
was fine
army?
with it. It's not my favorite thing, but I was fine with it.
Um, so I remembered that reveal. And when I was rereading the book, I was like, I'm gonna pay attention to these statues this time. And I totally didn't. So like I still don't know how well it was foreshadowed. Like I'm like,
Yeah.
that kind of material just doesn't stay in my brain at all. They could have mentioned those statues in every single chapter and I would not have noticed. But I do say, like the first time, I was like, Vasher's like, all of these statues, they are my secret army. And I was like, there are statues? Like I had no idea. It
Yes.
honestly felt like to me that he was just like, and there are statues. And so
I knew I paid somewhat attention to it because Vivenna in her POVs was talking about these statues a few times, and I was like, okay, she likes these statues. Like, obviously, they don't have these kind of statues in Idris, was my main thing. Um, but I'm kind of indifferent to it at the end. I don't think it's necessarily like the biggest plot device ever, but it kind of just is, and that's fine.
fair enough. I
Uh,
have no idea, Daniel. The Men in Red and Gold, I think, are intentionally written so vaguely as to be theory crafting, and I just
yeah.
get mad when I'm like, Sanderson, give me more information. I know what you're doing here, so
I'm
I'm
not
not
gonna
interested in
lie
the
in
answer
that
to the question.
I've blocked out a lot of Era 2 in my brain because
Oh,
it wasn't my
oh.
favorite, so yeah, but that's okay.
Jake is messaging me from the
Jake,
glossary.
we're
Instinctive
having a
awakening.
discussion right now,
I know, but
Jake.
no, it's relevant. It's relevant. All persons of the sixth heightening and above immediately understand and can use basic awakening commands without training or practice. More difficult commands are easier for them to master and to discover. So, Josh,
Boom.
ya basic.
He's devastated right now. Oh,
That's a
man.
devastating earth insult.
So overall, were you pleased with did it live up to the original expectations on the reread, would you say?
I think it exceeded them because it's hard for me to have known if it was like really one of my favorite Cosmere books. And now I'm like, no, I confidently, it's like all of Stormlight and then this book.
All okay, so it is above Mistborn for you.
See, I always forget about Mistborn. I have to reread Mistborn too. That's the thing, is that it's been so long. But I think it's about level with Hero of Ages. I don't know. I have to
Okay,
reread.
well, Hero of Ages is My least
Listen,
favorite of that bunch.
go reread Way of Kings because you don't know what you're talking about.
I honestly am now debating at some point rereading Way of Kings because I've grown to love Stormlight so much. So at
I
some
think
point,
now that you have context, you will reread it at some point and really like it. But like, you have like 8 years before
I know
Stormlight
I've got
6.
quite a bit of time,
Your
so I'm not gonna rush
child
it.
is gonna be able to read it with you by the time.
I know it's gonna be crazy, but also, I mean, it's a whole book with Kaladin's POV, so I'm not in a rush to read it.
You're such a hater. You and my wife can like talk about how much Kaladin's mid, and I'll just go somewhere else because it's a ridiculous statement.
We can talk about it at Dragonsteel. Jess and I will have great conversations
Yeah.
about it. It'll be awesome. Meanwhile, Bookborn will be off like collecting stickers, and Jess and I will be in a corner talking about our disliking of Kaladin.
I'll be reading Stormlight. I'll be like,
I know. Oh, it's gonna be so good. Okay, so any final words, opinions, feelings on Warbreaker and our Cosmere in general?
this leatherbound's worth it. It's highly readable. The God King's text is in purple, and this is a cool little illustration. And Warbreaker is a very good Cosmere novel that I recommend and that I love. And Nightblood is awesome.
Nightblood is awesome. I also highly encourage people, if they haven't read Warbreaker or haven't read it in a while,
This
go back
cover
and-
sucks. Send messages to everybody and tell them to re-release this cover because it's the worst. That's my last statement.
Yeah, it really doesn't have much to do with anything.
It looks like she's eating a gusher, like not a gusher. One of those like
this is
candies.
True. Yes, we can talk about this, Caleb. Nightblood.
Yeah, Nightblood is awesome. I feel like we did kind of cover it, but not in specifics.
We did not talk about him all that much. So Nightblood, you learn a little bit more about Nightblood, right, in Stormlight, which gives a bit more.
Have you read Stormlight?
What? He has not read Stormlight.
So the long and short of it is Nightblood is fucking crazy.
Yeah, he
very,
is.
very, very powerful. And so,
yeah, he is.
Yeah,
and
this is the first hint of that.
Delightful. It's so delightful. And if you like him in this one, you will love him in Stormlight. It's basically all that it comes down to. But Nightblood is a character. I just love when they give sentience to inanimate objects, basically. And
this might have been the first time I'd ever come across it. Like, I don't know. Like, I wasn't very well versed in fantasy when I read this book, but I remember thinking, I was like, here's how basic I was. I was like, a talking sword. How novel. I had no idea this was just a thing that has been in fantasy for decades.
Yeah, I'd have to think about it, but I don't think I've encountered one that I love the way that I love Nightblood. Yeah, Caleb from the prologue was all about Nightblood.
I actually have a funny story.
I
just have to keep going back to my wife's reading of this. She was reading it, and like it was after she had like read a bunch of it. She put it down for like 6 months, and she was reading it, and she was complaining about Lightsong. I was like, "Well, what's going on in the book?" Because I wanted to know about the Denth Tonk reveal, and I knew that's when she would get invested. So trying to suss out when that was going on. She said, "I don't know. There's like this guy, and he has another guy that's a friend of his, and they want to kill this other guy, but they're trying to be sneaky about it." I'm like, "Who are you talking about?" And I was like, "What? Like this is not in the book." And she had been zoned out so much that she forgot that Nightblood was a sword. So she thought Vasher and Nightblood were like a duo of humans trying to kill Denth and Tong Fa. And I was like, "You know, Nightblood's a sword, right?" And she's like, "No, I didn't."
That's hilarious and perfect in so many ways because Nightblood is basically a person. So I completely agree with her assessment of that. I think that's delightful. All right. To wrap up, thank you everybody for joining us. Go read Warbreaker or reread Warbreaker. Kyle, tell people where they can find you on the YouTube.
I am read by Kyle, and I'm also read by Kyle on Instagram, and I will be making more videos soon. So look forward to that.
In his new room.
And thanks for having me on, Laura. It
always
was a good time to talk Sanderson as always, and
yes,
you didn't make me too mad about Dawn Shard. So.
There's still time. Right. I cannot. Oh, yeah. It's gonna be good. It's gonna. Yeah.
I don't even know if we'll see that.
Sorry.
I don't even know if we'll see that in Stormlight 5. We might have to wait for the back half on that.
I think it'll probably be the back half, but we'll all be gray at that point. It'll be good. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you for joining
Bye,
us. If you're
everybody.
catching us on a reread, tell us what you love about Warbreaker down in the comments. And thank
Jake, you
you,
the
Jake,
MVP.
the real MVP, the GOAT, even though you went to, a university that is not the GOAT, but that's fine. All right. Have a good night, everybody.